Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining our first presentation for the adaptive gaming experiences. Today, we have a presentation from Drew Redepinning, and it's an introduction to adaptive gaming equipment. So very excited about this today. Before we get started, I did want to make an announcement that if you require special accommodations and in marketing and messaging, please join our Discord so we can assist further. And the Discord channel is in our Twitch chat if you're watching it there. Um, so I wanted to introduce Drew Redepinning first, who's an assistive technology specialist and biomedical engineer. Drew has been in assistive technology for 4 years of experience, and he has formerly worked as an assistive technology specialist at Courage Kidney Rehabilitation Institute in Minnesota. Drew remains involved with Cougar Kidney's assistive technology department as a volunteer, and he currently works as an assistive technology specialist for technology for home performing in-home assistive technology assessments. In addition, Drew volunteers his time handling all assistive technology services for St. Margaret's Center in Albany, New York, and performs assistive technology services for Albany Medical Center. His primary focuses are in environmental access, adaptive gaming, device access, vocational technology, and developing custom assistive technology solutions. Drew is also currently an MD student at Albany Medical College in New York and is hoping to pursue a future career in physical medicine and rehabilitation. Also joined with us today, we have a panel of members of our that are close to this program. We have Dr. Tepper, Vice President of the United Spinal Atlanta chapter. We have Adina Bradshaw, who's an assistive technology specialist as well, and formed that relationship with Drew. We also have Jared, who's part of our United Spinal esports team. We also have the Evolve team here, Kevin, Brian, and myself, Jordan. And then we have members of the Quad Gods, who are an esports team. We have Richard Jacobs, Blake, and Prentice with us as well. So before we get started with the presentation, I just wanted to give an overview of what it's about. So this is content focused on gaming solutions for individuals with SCI and adaptations for specific games, and helping choose appropriate games based on interest, setup, and functioning. And last but not least, why some people would be here today as well, is we have a giveaway. So the giveaway question is, what is your favorite piece of adaptive gaming equipment, or not just adaptive gaming equipment, but just gaming equipment, and why? We'll post that in the Twitch channel. In order to be eligible for winning, we're giving away 3 $50 Steam gift cards. You'll need to follow the Twitch channel, join the United Spinal Atlanta Discord, and then also post the answer to the question in our giveaways channel. And then at the end of the presentation, we will use a randomizer to pick winners after the presentation is over. So with all that being said, I will pass the presentation or for Drew to do a presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the intro. So today I'm just going to go over just an introduction to adaptive gaming equipment, just to give an overview to everyone of what's out there, and then how to get started with adaptive gaming equipment, and how to also perform an adaptive gaming assessment. So you already got an intro to me. Like they said, I'm a biomedical engineer and assistive technology practitioner, and I've been doing adaptive gaming for the past 4 or 5 years now, through a variety of different places. I love adaptive gaming. Gaming's such a fun and social activity, and it's so amazing to be able to allow someone to participate in adaptive gaming or gaming again after a significant event like a spinal cord injury. because of the huge quality of life and social benefits that it provides. So today we're going to be talking about a lot of those solutions and also talking about the benefits of gaming as well. So before we get started on the equipment, I'm just going to get everyone an overview of what adaptive gaming is. So adaptive gaming is a field in assistive technology where we work with people who aren't physically able to access a standard gaming controller and look at adaptive equipment that'll allow them to play those games. So this could be through using head movements or sipping and blowing into holes or using large adaptive joysticks or switches to play video games instead of just standard controllers that they might not be able to access. So here's a quick video I like to show people. This person is using a adaptive gaming controller to play a variety of different video games. So they're using a device called the Quad Stick, and this device allows them to sip and blow into different holes for the different controls, and then move the joystick using head movements and lip movements to move their player in the game. So as you can see here, they can play a variety of different games just by sipping and blowing and moving head movements without accessing a standard video game controller. So why is adaptive gaming so important? So gaming itself has really grown into this big social activity where you can play online with people and socially interact with people, and then also play locally with friends and family and socially interact. So you get a lot of social benefits from playing video games and gaming in general. So it provides a lot of social benefits for people to play video games. It also has a lot of functional benefits, which we'll talk about in the next slide. And overall, participation in gaming, I find, improves quality of life because it allows people to get those social interactions through gaming, increase participation in activities they enjoy, and overall greater independence and fun in their life. So I want everyone to keep in mind, just throughout the slideshow, we're not going to go in detail on this, but adaptive gaming equipment can translate to other activities of daily independence. So I work in assistive technology and I work with people to help them access their computer in addition to playing video games. However, a lot of times this adaptive gaming equipment can also be used for things like accessing the computer and other areas of daily independence as well. So as you saw in the end of that video you just saw, that person is using their adaptive gaming equipment to also access the computer. And that person's actually graduating this year with their bachelor's degree using their adaptive gaming equipment to do all their schoolwork. So adaptive gaming is also translatable to these other areas of daily independence. So I always look at gaming alongside other areas of assistive technology needs. So before we go through the specific controllers that are available to allow people to play video games using adaptive controllers, I want to first talk about how I approach adaptive gaming assessments and the important things I look at when I'm setting someone up with adaptive gaming equipment. So the first thing I want to know for someone is their age and experience with gaming. More importantly, their experience with gaming. So I really want to know, since their spinal cord injury or whatever event they had, when's the last time they gamed and if they've ever gamed before. So if you're working with someone who's never played video games before or hasn't played in a long time, they're going to be learning to use an adaptive controller in addition to also learning to play video games again. So you got to be really careful what language you use with that person because they might not be familiar with the gaming lingo that we typically use and that people who do game are familiar with. For example, most people who game know that the left and right triggers are for aiming and shooting for playing games. However, if I were to tell that to someone who isn't familiar with gaming or hasn't gamed in a long time, that might not make sense to them. So you got to be really careful for explaining games and explaining adaptive controllers for people who might not have gamed in a long time or have never gamed before. Another really important thing to look at is the types of games someone wants to play and their overall goals for adaptive gaming. So games lie on a huge spectrum of difficulty, which we'll talk more about later. but some people just want to play some easier games, and some people want to play those high-paced online games. So that's really important for me to know because that really impacts the setup we want to look at. Because if somebody wants to play more those more complex games, we need to look into a more complex setup and really optimize that setup to allow them to play those more complex games. The other thing we look at that's really important for setting someone up with an adaptive controller is their functional abilities and cognition. So functional abilities is really important for choosing the right adaptive controller. So functional abilities is where they have function left after their injury. So if somebody has just control of their head and neck movements and is able to have respiratory control, then we'd look at a sip and puff controller. So we want to look at where we can take advantage of their function and where that matches with the adaptive gaming equipment that's on the market. And then also cognition is important as well. So if somebody had a mild traumatic brain injury after an accident, and they might have a little bit of limited cognition, it's important to know that because then we might not want to start with some more of those complex games that are out there. We want to work our way up to those because it might be hard for that person to wrap their head around some of those more complex games at first or a more complex setup. Personal factors are also a really important thing. I'm sure a lot of people out there who play video games get really frustrated and might have bashed a controller or two in their day after they've lost. So it's really important to know how frustrated a person gets when they're playing video games and other personal factors surrounding them. You really want to kind of ride a fine line with someone and set someone up with an adaptive controller and set someone up with a game that will challenge them, but at the same time not frustrate them so much where they don't want to play video games again. So you want to choose a game that's going to be easy enough for them to boost their confidence, but also challenge them to get them used to using that adaptive controller. And for people who might be more motivated or might not be affected as much by that frustration, you might be able to start off with some of those more complex games, even though they're dying more frequently. And then finally, I always look at adaptive controllers alongside other assistive technology needs, because like I said before, a lot of these adaptive controllers can be used for other areas of daily independence. So now we're going to jump into looking at the adaptive controllers that are on the market. This isn't not an exhaustive list of adaptive controllers. These are just the most popular options and the ones I use most frequently with people when I'm setting them up with adaptive gaming equipment. So I like to look at adaptive controllers along a spectrum of how someone's limited in accessing the standard gaming controller. So somebody could have difficulties with fine motor control, or the person can have purely motor difficulty accessing the controller, and this lies alongside a spectrum as well. So for someone with difficulties with fine motor control, this means that the person can't access those small buttons and small joysticks that are on the controller because they don't have enough fine motor control to access all of the small buttons and small joysticks. Therefore, we need to look at controllers that have larger joysticks and larger buttons that they can access instead of accessing these small buttons and joysticks that are on the controller. One of the best options that are out there for plugging in large joysticks and large switches to play video games is the Xbox Adaptive Controller. So the Xbox Adaptive Controller is probably one of the most well-known adaptive controllers that's out there. And what the Xbox Adaptive Controller is a gaming rig that allows you to plug in adaptive joysticks and adaptive switches to replace the buttons on the standard controller. So I can plug in a large adaptive joystick into the slot in the Xbox Adaptive Controller to replace my joystick on the controller, and then large accessible adaptive switches for the different buttons on the controller. So now the person can access the controller using large joysticks and large switch buttons. One limitation of this controller is that it doesn't really work great as a standalone controller to play really complex video games, like those online games like Call of Duty or games requiring a lot of controls. Because as you can imagine, if I have a game that requires me to use 2 joysticks and 10 switches, and I have to access those really fast, it's going to be really hard for someone to access both those joysticks and really quickly access all those switches to play that game really effectively. So if you're using this alone, it really only works great for some of those simpler games. One great thing though about the Xbox Adaptive Controller is that there's a lot of different options for affordable and customizable adaptive switches and adaptive joysticks that can plug in and work with this controller. And these are some of my favorite resources out there for affordable and customizable joysticks and switches. And we'll go over a couple of these specific options that are my favorite in the next few slides. So Warfighter Engage is one of my favorite sites for affordable adaptive joysticks and switches that are compatible with the Xbox Adaptive Controller. They have a lot of different 3D printed options for joysticks, and these are under $60, so they're fairly affordable compared to other options. And they have things from large adaptive joysticks to small thumbsticks, so you can really find the specific joystick and switches that really meet the person's needs that you're working with. Other great resources that are out there, specifically for adaptive switches, is the Logitech Adaptive Gaming Kit. The Logitech Adaptive Gaming Kit is a kit full of adaptive switches that work with the Xbox Adaptive Controller, and there's a set of 12 of them, and it's under $100, so that's less than $10 per switch. So the switches are quite a bit more affordable than other adaptive switches on the market. And then a really good option for a good durable joystick for someone who might be a little bit rougher on the joystick, or that needs a joystick with a little bit more resistance to it when they're playing, is the Ultramark UltraStick from QuadStick. And this device can be fitted with a T-bar stick that a lot of people use for controlling their power wheelchair. So this joystick might be really familiar with them to use. Here's a quick video of someone using the Xbox Adaptive Controller with 2 switches plugged in and a adaptive joystick from Warfighters Engage. So here they're just accessing the 2 large accessibility switches for the different buttons in the game, and then they're using the joystick to steer back and forth. And they don't have to use those small buttons that are on the standard controller. They can just use these large accessible options that we plugged into the Xbox Adaptive Controller. So the Xbox Adaptive Controller is one option that's out there, but the other option that's very similar to the Xbox Adaptive Controller is called the Hori Flex Controller. So the Hori Flex Controller is the exact same as the Xbox Adaptive Controller, in that it allows you to plug in adaptive joysticks and adaptive switches to replace the control on the standard controller. However, the Hori Flex Controller is specifically made for the Nintendo Switch console and not the Xbox console like the Xbox Adaptive Controller is. So one benefit of this is that the Nintendo Switch console has really simple games and pretty fun games actually to play. So a lot of the games on Nintendo Switch don't require a lot of controls to play, and they're much simpler for people to play as well. So this works great for an adaptive controller like this, because like I said before, these controllers that you need to plug in these large adaptive joysticks and large switches into is really hard to play those really complex games. So it's really nice to be able to play with the Nintendo Switch, because a lot of the games, like I said, are much simpler to play. The other great thing about the Hori Flex Controller is that it can actually be used to work alongside eye gaze, so a person can actually play a game with their eyes, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later. A couple drawbacks of the Hori Flex Controller, though, is that it costs quite a bit more than the Xbox Adaptive Controller. So it's about $250 versus $100, which is the price of the Xbox Adaptive Controller. And another kind of drawback from it is that there's not as many compatible joysticks that work with the Hori Flex Controller compared to the Xbox Adaptive Controller. Like I said, Warfighters Engage makes a lot of adaptive joysticks, and unfortunately, those are not compatible with the Hori Flex Controller. The only really adaptive joystick that works with the Hori Flex Controller is the Optima joystick from Praetorian Technologies, and that's pictured here to the right. And besides that, there aren't really a lot of really good adaptive joysticks options that work with the Hori Flex Controller. However, for adaptive switches, all the adaptive switches that work with the Xbox Adaptive Controller also work with the Hori Flex as well. So the adaptive switches is not typically a problem. Another option that can be used for someone who has fine motor controls, accessing controls on a standard controller, is using large arcade-style joysticks. So there's a couple different options, such as the Mayflash F300 Fight Stick and the Blue Tip Gaming Axis controllers that are large arcade-style joysticks that a person can use to access the controls on the controller using large joysticks and large arcade-style buttons. So one benefit of these options is that they're an all-in-one option for a plug-and-play option that works with games for an adaptive controller. However, a drawback is that you can't really customize this setup. So wherever these buttons are placed is wherever they're placed on this arcade stick is where they're going to stay, because you can't move them around. versus the Xbox Adaptive Controller and the Hori Flex, where you can plug in the joysticks and move them to any place you want. So you can really customize and optimize the setup to meet that specific person's need. So I don't typically use these options because you can't really customize them. But if this setup really works for someone, it's another option just to be aware of. So now we're going to move along from someone who has fine motor difficulties accessing controller to someone who has mobility limitations. So first, we're going to start with someone who is somewhat limited in accessing controller, meaning they can access some of the buttons on the controller, but they can't access all the buttons they need in order to play a game. This could be someone who can access only half of the controller, so they might have really good function of one half of their body, say the right half of their body, but not as good a function of the left half, so they can't access the left side of the controller. Or this could just be someone who might have weak finger muscles, so they can't access the trigger buttons on the top of the controller. So a couple good options for someone who can only partially access the controls on the controller is a company called Evil Controllers. So Evil Controllers is an awesome company that actually takes standard controllers and they adapt them and move buttons and joysticks to different places. So a person who can't access the buttons where they're typically placed in the controller can use alternative locations to access those buttons. And we'll go over a couple of these options in the next couple of slides. But this company adapts PS5 controllers, Xbox controllers, PS4 controllers, so you can really find all the options out there for any specific console that you want. So for someone who can only access half of the controller, Evil Controllers makes a one-handed controller. And what they do is they move all the buttons over to the side of the controller where the person can access. So if the person can't access the left half of the controller, they move buttons over to the right half of the controller so the person can access them using their right hand on the bottom of the controller. And then they move the left joystick to an external joystick that the person can access using their elbow or another part of their body on the right side. So now the person can, even though they can't access the left side of the controller, they can access all the controls they need just using the right side of their body. And for someone who might not be able to access certain controls on the controller because they don't have the finger strength to get up to the triggers, you can get a adaptive controller that moves buttons to the back of the controller. So now instead of moving their fingers up to access the triggers on the top of the controller, they can actually just access them from the back of the controller as pictured on the bottom. They also have adaptive options, so it actually reduces the amount of force needed to activate the buttons on the controller. So if somebody just can't, they can actually access the buttons, but they don't have enough force to actually push down and press the buttons, they can adapt the controller to reduce the force needed to access those specific buttons on the controller. So there's a lot of different options they have for just adapting a standard gaming controller. So besides Evil Controllers, another really great option for someone who can only access partially the controls on a controller to play a game, but can't access all of them that they need to play a game. A person can use Copilot with the Xbox Adaptive Controller. So the Xbox Adaptive Controller we already talked about, but Copilot is a feature on Xbox that allows you to use two controllers to act as one controller on your console. Therefore, you can set up the standard Xbox controller and the Xbox Adaptive Controller to work together to allow them to play a game. So you can set up a standard controller in their hands and they can access all the controls they need or they can access on the standard controller. And for the buttons they can't access, you can plug those into the Xbox Adaptive Controller and mount them next to parts of their body where they can access those controls. Therefore, then you can use both of these controllers together in order to play the game they want to play by accessing both the controls on the respective controllers. So here's just a quick picture that I got offline of a setup for someone who's using the Xbox controller with Copilot. So as you can see, they have a standard controller set up in the middle so they can access all the controls they can access using the standard controller. And for the buttons they can't access, they have adaptive switches and adaptive joysticks set up. So now they can use both these two systems together to play the game they want to play. So now we're going to move up the mobility ladder and talk about someone who is significantly limited in accessing controller. So this would be someone with a higher level spinal cord injury who might have some upper extremity movement or no upper extremity movement. So they can't really access a standard gaming controller with their hands because they don't have that finger control. So here we need to look into options like sip and puff options for adaptive gaming controllers like the Quad Stick. So the quad stick is one of my favorite adaptive controllers on the market. So this really works great, like I said, for someone with a higher level spinal cord injury who doesn't have the finger control to access a standard gaming controller. So what the quad stick is a adaptive video game controller that has a joystick that the person can access by moving their head and neck. And then it has sip and puffs that the person can blow and sip into for the different controls on the controller. So the person can do different combinations of sips and puffs into this device here, and that can be programmed for specific buttons on the controller. And the great thing about the quad stick is that you can program over 30 controls into one configuration of the quad stick. So the person can access quite a few different buttons, and that allows them to play pretty much any game they want to play. One drawback of the quad stick is that it does cost a little bit more. It's about $550. However, this is pretty affordable compared to other sip and puff options that are out there on the market. So it's about half the cost of other sip and puff controllers on the market. So it's actually pretty affordable in that respect. So here's a quick video of someone gaming with a pretty complex game with the quad stick. So as you can see here, they're sipping and puffing into the controller for different controls on the device, and then they're moving the joystick with their head movements to access and move their player. So the thing that makes the quad stick so great and allows someone to play pretty much any video game they want just by moving a joystick with their mouth and sipping and puffing into this device is that it's really customizable. So I can program the quad stick so any sip and puff combination can be any control on the controller. So I can really optimize it for any game someone wants to play. So I can create a profile that works really great for a specific game. So the great thing about the quad stick, like I said, is that it's so customizable, but the limitation of that is that it's really complex to learn how to set up. And a lot of people, I think, are a little discouraged by how complex it is, so they don't typically go for it as an adaptive controller. However, there's a lot of different pre-made profiles out there that can be downloaded for specific games, and those are available on the quad stick site. So you don't really need to know how to program a profile from scratch necessarily. All you need to do is be able to find those profiles, and you can upload them to your quad stick, and then you use those pre-made profiles to play specific games. But if you do want to learn how to program the quad stick, some really great resources to start are listed at the bottom. The top one is the user documentation for the quad stick, which kind of just goes and gives an overview on how to program the quad stick. And the next two are just YouTube videos. Some of them are some that I made. They go over and kind of break down how to program the quad stick for specific games. So now we're going to go up the mobility ladder and just talk about someone who's extremely limited in their mobility, and even the quad stick itself isn't enough for them to play games. So this would be someone who doesn't really have lateral head movement, so they can't access all the sip and puffs on the quad stick to play the games they want to play. So here we need to look at really complex setups. So we're not going to really go in detail in these setups, but I'm just going to give everyone an overview of some options, just so everyone's aware that there are options for people who are extremely limited in their ability to access adaptive controllers. So for someone who might not be able to access all the sip and puffs on the quad stick, like I said, so someone with limited lateral head movement, and maybe can only access the center sip and puff, so they can't access all the ones they need in order to play, you can actually plug in adaptive joysticks and adaptive switches to the back of the quad stick to kind of work alongside the front of the quad stick, so the person can use both of those different options together to play. So let's say someone, like I said, can't access the side sip and puffs on the quad stick, but they might have a little bit of finger movement on both of their thumbs. Therefore, I can plug in two adaptive switches into the back of the quad stick that the person can access using their thumbs, and then they can access the face of the quad stick using all the controls they can access, and they can use those two access methods together to play the games they want to play. So just by plugging in different options to the back of the quad stick, you can supplement it to allow someone to play specific games. Another option is using eye gaze. So there's a couple different options out there for using eye gaze to play video games. And how eye gaze works is you can create virtual buttons on the screen that the person can look at for different controls on the controller. So we're not going to go in detail on how to set these up, but a couple different options out there are, like I said, the Hori Flex has a program that allows you to use eye gaze to play video games. And then Project Iris is a program that allows you to play video games using your eyes on PC computers. And then finally, voice control is also an option for playing games. So there are a couple of different programs out there that allow you to play video games using your voice. However, I never use this as a primary option for someone to play video games because there's always a delay with voice commands and there's always mistakes that these voice recognition programs make. So they're not really great for video games alone. I only use voice control to supplement some of the other adaptive gaming controllers so the person can use the adaptive controller and then just use voice control to access the controls they might not be able to access using the other adaptive controller. So here's a couple different options that are listed on the page that allow someone to access controls using their voice. So now that we talked about all those different adaptive controllers, now a good question is, when do I use each controller? So I kind of broke it up on how a person's limited in accessing controller, but here I'm just going to kind of reinforce that and talk about when I would introduce a specific adaptive gaming controller for someone based off of what limitations they have on accessing a controller. So for someone with a lower cervical level spinal cord injury who might have good upper extremity movement and some finger movement, then I would look at the Xbox adaptive controller with Copilot or Evil controllers. Because they have finger movement, they're able to partially access a standard controller. So we want to look at just adaptations to standard controllers like Evil controllers, or supplement the standard controller with the Xbox adaptive controller to allow them to play. However, for someone with a mid-cervical level spinal cord injury with upper extremity movement but no finger movement, we want to kind of look at other options besides Evil controllers and Xbox adaptive controller. So let's say someone has some upper extremity movement, but they don't have any finger movement. We probably want to look at a sip and puff controller like the Quad Stick, even if they have upper extremity movement, because large adaptive joysticks are going to be really fatiguing for them to play specific games. So the Quad Stick is probably a better option, especially if they want to play more complex video games. And if you're working with someone with a high level spinal cord injury and who doesn't have any upper extremity movement, then we really want to look at the Quad Stick, because then they're going to really only be able to use a sip and puff and head controlled joystick. And then they also might need additional options, like we talked about, like voice control or eye gaze, if the Quad Stick alone isn't enough for them to play. So now we're going to talk about just setting up a controller. So we talked about all the adaptive controllers that I primarily use, but now I'm going to talk about how I look at a setup for someone and what are the really important things to look at when you want to really optimize that setup for a specific game to allow them to play to the best of their ability. So what makes a good adaptive gaming setup? So you don't want to just throw a bunch of switches and joysticks in front of someone and tell them to play, because that's really not going to optimize that setup for someone to play that specific game. So controls should really be strategically placed based on how often a control is used in a game, how quickly the control needs to be accessed, and how much fine motor control is needed. So it's really important to know all those things for the specific controls so you can really place them in the right position for someone to play that game most effectively. So you want to look at the person's function that they have and then connect that with whatever controls are in the game and kind of match those together to optimize that setup for that specific person. So for example, for controls requiring a lot of precision and fine motor control, like moving a sight on when you're aiming or steering when you're playing a racing game, you want to place those controls where the person has the most fine motor control, because they need a lot of fine motor control to access those specific controls. So when we're looking at fine motor control, we want to look at parts of the body that have the most precision and most fine motor movement. So the best option is the hands. So we want to look at maybe the thumb or the index finger if they're able to move those parts of their body. So if they're able to move those parts of their body, we want to place those controls next to those specific muscle groups. And then if they don't have access to that option, then we want to look at things like maybe a chin or mouth control joystick. So there's actually a lot of small muscles in your mouth and chin, and a lot of the muscles that we use for facial expression are really small and allow us to make really fine motor movements. So a lot of chin control or lip control joysticks actually work really well for fine motor control because they have a lot of really small muscle groups to allow them to make really fine, precise movements to adjust those controls. So that's another really good access point for someone to have those fine motor controls for those controls in games requiring a lot of precision. And finally, hand-controlled joysticks are a good option if the person has good wrist movement. So if the person doesn't have really good wrist movement and they're accessing those large joysticks using the larger muscle groups of their arm, like their shoulder or their biceps, it's going to be really fatiguing for them, and they're not going to get that fine motor control that they really need in order to make those fine adjustments for those controls like aiming or steering. Next, we also want to look at controls that require a lot of speed and are frequently used in games. So certain controls like attacking, shooting, dodging, jumping, and sprinting are things in games that you access a lot, and you really need to be able to access really quickly and effectively in order to play a specific game. So if I'm playing a game and I'm playing Call of Duty, I need to be able to shoot and dodge and jump really quickly in order to stay alive and effectively play a specific game. So these controls should be placed in a location that's going to be really quick for the person to access and really easy to access and not very fatiguing, since they're going to be accessing those controls repeatedly. So when we're looking at options for locations where a person needs to access a control very fast and frequently, we want to look at parts of the body that are really quick for them to access. So if we're looking at speed of access, accessing a switch with the finger is going to be much faster than accessing it with the whole hand. And also we want to place those switches in a location that's going to be very fast for them. So really close to their body and really close to where they're resting. So they don't have to move very far to access those controls. And then if we're using the quad stick, we want to place the really frequently used controls in the middle sip and puff, because that's typically where the person's mouth rests when they're playing. So as the person's playing, their mouth rests over the middle sip and puff. So we want to put the controls like shoot and aim over the middle sip and puff, because that's going to be the quickest for them to access, because that's where their mouth is resting when they're using the controller. And then also, most importantly, when you're setting someone up with adaptive gaming equipment or you're doing an adaptive gaming assessment, always try to use the adaptive gaming equipment yourself first. So that way you can really see what really works for you, and then you can help that person find what really works for them because you have experience using that equipment. So now that we talked about the adaptive controllers, we talked about the setup, now we're going to talk about selecting the right games. So selecting the right games is actually super important because a lot of different games kind of lie on a spectrum of difficulty. So some games are much easier to play with than others. And since adaptive controllers a lot of times aren't really familiar for people and they do take a lot of time to learn how to use, you want to start with easier games and then you work your way up to those harder games as a person becomes more skilled with an adaptive controller. So certain games are easier to play than others because certain games have fewer controls, they don't rely as much on speed, and they also have much less complicated gameplay. So those games are really a really good starting point for someone using an adaptive controller. So it's important to know which games are easier to start with on a new controller. And I'm going to talk about some examples next and some examples of when we want to start someone off with simpler games and work our way up to those more complex games. So depending on the adaptive controller someone's using, they may or may not need to start with simpler games. So if someone's using the quad stick, they're probably going to need to start with some simpler games before they work up to some of those more complex games like Call of Duty or Red Dead Redemption, or games requiring a lot of controls. Because not a lot of people have played a video game before by sipping and puffing into holes and then moving a joystick with their head. So it's a really unfamiliar way of the game. So a person it's going to take them a little bit of time to get used to that access option before they can play some of those more complex games. However, if somebody's using Evil Controller's controller where we're just moving the buttons around on a standard controller, they probably don't need to start with easier games just because you're using a standard controller already and all that you're doing is moving buttons around at different locations. And then if we're using the Xbox Adaptive Controller and the Hori Flex controller, we might need to start with simpler games because like I said, the Xbox Adaptive Controller and the Hori Flex controller, if you're using those alone, you're not really going to be able to play those complex games because they require a lot of switches and and you need to be able to access those controls really quickly. And that setup's not really going to work well for those complex games. So what makes certain games more difficult to play than others? So easier games, typically I think of as single joystick games that only require 2 or 3 buttons to play. And they also don't require a lot of speed. So they don't require a lot of controls. They're not very fast games. So they're pretty easy to set up with adaptive equipment. So a lot of Nintendo Switch games are like this, and that's why I like the Nintendo Switch as a console, especially for someone who needs those easier games. Then intermediate games are going to be faster paced single joystick games with more buttons, or slower paced 2 joystick games with more controls. And then hard games get into those games like Call of Duty, Red Dead Redemption. So 2 joystick games that are fast paced, that require a lot of controls to play. And like I said, pretty much any first person shooter game is going to be a pretty hard game to play. And then extremely hard games are those games that can really only play online, like Fortnite, because you can't really adjust the difficulty there since you're playing with people online. And then those games that have a lot of different combinations of controls to play. So like I said before, different consoles will have different games too. Like the Nintendo Switch, I said, has much easier games to play on. So Nintendo Switch has games like Mario Kart, Super Smash Bros, and Pokemon that are much easier games to play because they have a lot less controls and they're much slower paced than games on the Xbox and PlayStation. However, the Xbox and PlayStation have those games like Call of Duty, and Red Dead Redemption that a lot of users want to play. So it's important to know which games are available on different consoles before you choose a console for someone to play with their adaptive gaming equipment. So overall, like I said, Nintendo Switch is really good for someone who really needs those simple games to play. And for just consoles in general, Xbox is probably just going to be the best console for average gamer because it's most accessible compared to the PlayStation console, and has a lot of those games that most users want to play. And then another thing to keep in mind too is that you don't really need to get a if you're using like the Xbox adaptive controller, you don't really need to get the Hori Flex controller in order to play with the Nintendo Switch. If you get something called an adapter. So an adapter is a device that tricks your console into thinking that the controller you're using is for that specific console. So if I have the Xbox adaptive controller set up for someone, they can actually use the Xbox adaptive controller to play on the Nintendo Switch just by using an adapter. So an adapter will trick my Nintendo Switch into thinking that my Xbox adaptive controller is for my Nintendo Switch console. So like I said, these adapters allow you to use any adaptive gaming controller with any console. And that's just something that everyone should keep in mind. So you don't really need to get a new console based off what adaptive gaming controller you use. So now I'm just going to go over my top picks for games when I'm using and setting someone up with adaptive gaming equipment. So here are some options I use in different categories. So for someone who really just needs a really super easy game with very few controls and just need to start off with a simple game to introduce them to adaptive gaming, my favorite option is Mario Kart. So Mario Kart's only available on Nintendo Switch, but it's one of the easiest games to play out there. So you can adjust the difficulty settings on Mario Kart to be very easy to start off with and very slow pace. You can also enable bumpers on the track. So if they start to steer off the track, it bumps them right back on. And then you can also enable something called auto accelerate. So it actually pushes the gas down on your car for you. So you don't have to keep on holding the gas down while you're driving. So all the person really needs to do is steer. So it's really easy since you don't need a lot of controls to play. And a lot of those kind of helpful features on there make it easier for someone to start off with. For just someone who's beginning to use adaptive gaming equipment, driving games are a really good place to start because driving games don't require a lot of controls. They are a little bit faster paced, but since they don't require a lot of controls, the person doesn't have to really think about all the different controls they need to play the game. Really, all you need to do is be able to hit the gas, steer, and maybe use boost or drift when you're playing. So you don't need a lot of controls in order to play these games, so they're a really great place to start. And then as far as sports games go, so if you're working with someone who likes sports games, FIFA is a really good option. So FIFA is available on pretty much any console. And FIFA doesn't require a lot of controls to play. All you need to be able to do is have one joystick to move your player. You need a button for shoot, a button for pass, and a couple other buttons for other functions in the game. And you can adjust the difficulty level to be really easy to start off with, and then gradually increase it as the person gets more skilled using the adaptive gaming equipment. So it's a really good sports game to start off with because it requires very few controls and you can adjust the difficulty quite a bit. And for first-person shooter games, so let's say you're working with someone who really wants to play Call of Duty. I never really ever start anyone off with Call of Duty because it's really hard to adjust the difficulty level. Easy enough for them to start off with playing and getting used to the controls. So my favorite first-person shooter game to start someone off with to play first-person shooter games using adaptive gaming equipment, especially the quad stick, is Battlefront 2. So besides the fact that I'm a huge Star Wars fan, Battlefront 2 is my favorite first-person shooter game to start someone off with because you can adjust the difficulty level to be very easy to start off with, and you can allow them to play as a hero in arcade mode. So they can start off with a player that has more health and has more powerful abilities than the other players they're playing against. So they have an advantage to start off with. So as they're getting used to the controls, they can build confidence playing a first-person shooter game, and also they're playing in a simpler way where they're not as risk of dying as quickly because they have more power and they're playing against weaker other players. So it's a great way to kind of introduce them, and then you can adjust the difficulty level as you go along and make the other players have more health and more abilities, and then kind of work your way up to more complex first person shooter games like Call of Duty. But Battlefront 2 is probably my favorite place to start for first person shooter games. And here's a quick video of someone playing Battlefront, and they're playing as a hero in an easier mode, so it's much easier for them to play. And this is a great way for them to get used to the movement in first person shooter games, especially on devices like the quad stick that are pretty complex controllers to get used to. And it kind of builds their confidence up too, because they're playing in a way where they're playing as more powerful players against weaker players, so they build confidence playing those first-person shooter games. And here's just a quick table that I've made that kind of ranks games based off difficulty, and this is just based off of kind of those things I was talking about based on how many controls the game has, how fast-paced it is, and really how complex overall the game is. So the easy and intermediate games are a great place to start someone off with for adaptive gaming equipment. And then the harder games are some things that someone can eventually work up to, but might not be able to be the best place for someone to start when they're using adaptive gaming equipment, especially things like the quad stick, which are going to be a little bit more complex controllers. So that's the end of this presentation. The end in the handout of the presentation has a couple of reference slides for specific things like how to order the quad stick and what specifications I use, as well as how to use different adapters for different combinations of adaptive controllers and consoles. But now I'm going to open it up to any questions anyone has from the content that was in the presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Drew. I will start off. I think we have a few questions asked from the chat that we definitely want to talk through with our panel. I wanted to kind of just start the conversation. I think we've kind of answered the question maybe a little bit already, but what kind of like resources exist out there, around adaptive gaming equipment, like a website or like a database? It just seems like from our work and like a lot of the information is scattered, or you might have to work with a professional. So that's one of the questions I had to kick it off. Do you have any guide there?
Yeah, so there's a lot of the number one place maybe to look is Able Gamers, which is a national organization that you can reach out to, and they can kind of counsel you on setting up with adaptive gaming equipment. Otherwise, a lot of especially larger rehab sites now are getting into adaptive gaming, so they might have outpatient providers that can help kind of introduce you to adaptive gaming equipment. But I agree, right now there's a lot of scattered information, and adaptive gaming is right now is something that's, I think, being built into a bigger thing. So I think the resources are increasing, but unfortunately, They are kind of scattered right now, but the best place to look would be either Able Gamers or possibly also just your local, if you have a local rehab site that has an assistive technology program, they might have people who are experts in adaptive gaming.
Cool. Thank you.
All right. I have been fielding some questions from the chats of our various streaming platforms. And this is, again, open to everybody on our discussion panel. We'd love to get all the people that Jordan had introduced at the beginning of the call to chime in with whatever their thoughts are. And also just a reminder, we are holding a giveaway where we are giving away three $50 Steam gift cards. You need to follow our Twitch channel and join our Discord channel. If you have any issues accessing either of those, feel free to look at the chat of whatever platform you're watching this on. We've been posting regularly about how to enter. But again, the question is, what is your favorite piece of gaming equipment and why? All right, moving on to the questions for our panel. Everybody feel free to chime in with your answers. This one is from Deflian Hayen, and I'm just going to go ahead and apologize ahead of time. I'm going to mispronounce probably every name because they are Twitch usernames. Anyways, from Deflian Hayen. Have there been any possible iterations of shoulder pad buttons? A friend has 2 buttons mounted under makeshift football pads that he says is the most useful for him when gaming. He uses it for gas and brake mostly, as he doesn't have use of his legs. I know that Adina had been messaging a little bit in the chat with Deflian Hayen, but we'd love to see what everybody on our panel has to say.
I would say the easiest. Hi, I'm Blake from the Quad Gods. I would say the easiest adaptation for that particular person is probably to take one of the Xbox adaptive controllers, because they're like, I have it in front of me so you can hear it. Like it's super clicky. It's very sensitive. I mean, so he could easily lean on it or place it in a position where he could just use his elbows or his shoulders. Because if you there's nothing out really right now unless it's being made, which I haven't heard anything about. But I would say as of right now, definitely the Xbox adaptive controller would probably be the easiest one to use for the time being, because there's so many different when you buy the kit, there's so many different buttons that come with it that you can literally pick whatever button works best for you, and put it in a position where it's very useful for yourself, because a lot of our teammates use the Xbox adaptive controllers. Most of the controllers that was spoken about here, I would say all of my teammates have one or the other. So I think it's important to like definitely use one of those. It's probably the easiest adaptable situation he can get himself into for the time being until something else comes up.
Absolutely. Does anybody else have any thoughts on that? If not, we'll move on to the next question. This one is from mnuke5280. What is your recommendation for people who don't have access to assessments/professionals to help to find the right fit? Is the first step to find someone to help, or is there a different starting place that doesn't require buying equipment and hoping it'll suit their needs?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that one more time?
Yeah, absolutely. What is your recommendation for people who don't have access to assessments/professionals to help find the right fit? Is the first step to find someone to help, or is there a different starting place that doesn't require buying equipment, hoping it'll suit their needs? I will mention Adina's answer that she had put in chat. She recommends reaching out to your state-funded AT program, assistive technology program, to see if they have resources that you can trial or know of assistive technology professionals who have experience with adaptive gaming in your area. She posted a link in the chat. I will post this across all platforms again, but it is www.at3, the number 3, center.net/state program. Again, that's www.at, the number 3, center.net/state program.
If I could chime in, this is Adina. I am an assistive technology professional, and I've been doing adaptive gaming for several years. But it is very frustrating because there's so little information out here. So this is why I'm so thankful that Drew was willing to do this presentation and provide these resources. But I typically really recommend you work with somebody to try equipment or get trials of equipment so that you're not wasting money and time and becoming frustrated by buying something that doesn't really work for you or work for someone else, when there are so many solutions out there. So every state has a state-funded assistive technology program. Some programs are more robust than others, but I always recommend, if you don't know where to start, at least start with your state-funded AT program and see if they know of other resources in your state. A lot of the state-funded resources have practitioners or satellites around the state, so either they can travel to you, or you could travel to them, or they can loan equipment. So I definitely recommend starting with them if you would like to try out equipment and switches.
Yeah, and I think to add on Adina's too is, especially even if you have like state providers, or you're working with assistive technology professionals who might not be experts in adaptive gaming. A lot of us in the assistive technology community especially know each other. So I get emails all the time of from people who are working in other areas in other states, who are assistive technology providers who aren't experts in adaptive gaming, to kind of ask recommendations. So we are part of those processes as well. So even if you're reaching out to those people who might have access to the equipment but might not be experts, a lot of us do communicate with each other, so we can even work together to provide those adaptive gaming services. Even if, like I said, your specific provider isn't an expert, they can reach out to people who are.
That's how Drew and I know each other. We have a network that we all, when we see something new, or we have a client we have questions about, we start reaching out. We go to conferences, and so we have a network, and we can try to figure things out or find someone that can help you. Often I feel like Drew also, people reach out to me and just ask questions, and we're here to help. We want to provide good solutions, but we also don't want you to waste money or be frustrated when you're learning. We want you to have a good initial experience with gaming.
It's fantastic. I have my own follow-up question. We don't have any more questions from the chat. If you guys have any more questions in the chat, please feel free to speak up, and we will get those answered. My own question is, we learned a little bit about, especially with like the HoriFlex controller, that you have the capability to add additional switches to your needs. Is there a good, I don't know if the word is a hub or a resource, to be able to find what switches might suit your needs if you're maybe not that familiar in the gaming scene, or not familiar with whatever your needs might be as a new or an experienced gamer?
Yeah, and I think this kind of goes into also, again, if you have someone in your community you can go to, so you can try all those different options, that would probably be the best place to start. Unfortunately, going online and searching for adaptive switches and things like that can be a little overwhelming, because there's so many different options out there. So if you don't have a lot of you don't really want to be just purchasing whatever adaptive switch you see. So it probably is best to go somewhere that you can kind of get that assessment, or you can go to a resource to try out those switches, would probably be the best option. Otherwise, if you're going to go and buy some switches, you probably would want to get the cheaper ones, like the ones from the Logitech Adaptive Gaming Set, which are quite a bit more affordable than other options, and they have a couple different switch options that are in the kit, so you can really find the one that works best for you. Otherwise, like if you search online, like I said, there's so many different switch options that are out there. So it's really hard to find which specific one will meet an individual's needs based off their function.
Hi, this is Dr. Tepper from United Spinal Atlanta. Solid D was saying that where he is, he's a para, but there's a number of guys or people with CP who are asking him about equipment. So what I did here in Atlanta, and really thanks for inspiration from the Quad Gods, was to apply for a grant from the Nielsen Foundation. So they had, each year they put out a call for proposals, and this was in the area of community integration or recreation. And so, I put forth an argument that there's a need for this program here, and I was able to get, quite a lot of money to get both gaming laptops and peripherals, and all these different controls. So, you know, wherever you are, you know, if there's maybe there's a group, you know, related to, you know, CP, or, you know, I'm kind of, I'm opening a LAN center, a gaming center in Atlanta. And as I tell people in the general esports community about what we're doing with the adaptive esports, there's a lot of excitement. So if you could connect with your general esports community and say what you want to do, maybe there's a fundraising possibility there. So I don't know a lot about the adaptive equipment. I rely on my team and Adina, but I do know how to raise money and put things together so that people do have access to these things. So, you know, that's, if you have a small body of people and you're willing to put in some work to find out some funding sources, I think there's a lot of people who might be willing to help you buy you know, a fitting kit. You know, it's what I refer this to.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Tepper, for chiming in. I have another question that I would like to pose. What do you guys think the next step in modernized adaptive gaming equipment and modernized adaptive gaming controllers are? Do you think that there is a next research step that needs to happen before any additional thing that can come out, or is there a big gap right now that exists that could be remedied with a little bit of technological influence?
I think one big thing that can be done, especially to make games, consoles and everything universally accessible and allow people to play using all types of adaptive equipment on any console, would be for hopefully someday all these different gaming companies who make games, who make consoles, to get together and kind of come up with regulations so we can, when they come out with a new console, come out with new games, it meets specific guidelines, so people who are using adaptive gaming equipment aren't limited because their adaptive gaming equipment doesn't work with that console or it doesn't work with that game. Because we're running into a lot of problems right now, especially with the new PlayStation console, where certain adaptive controllers can't be used for all the games that are on that console. So I think that kind of is the big step that needs to be made in coming up with specific guidelines for coming out with new things to make sure that they are accessible for everyone.
I was gonna say, I think in-game accessibility is extremely important. I had posted it in the chat because, like Dr. Drew said, there are a lot of games that are not really accessible. The major problem, like prime example, games like Fortnite, I play on the keyboard and the mouse, but it's more accessible if you're playing on a computer as opposed to if you're gaming on a controller. Because there are a lot of buttons that a lot of disabled people can't reach just in general. But like prime example, just to show you one major difference between keyboard and mouse and controller. On Fortnite, I can equip my character to auto run when I press a button. I don't have to hold the button. I could just tap it and then he'll just keep running until I tap it again, you know, or aiming, same thing, tap a button and it'll stay like that until I tap it again. As opposed to a controller, it doesn't do that. It's not even an option. So you constantly have to always hold the button, turn and everything. So, I mean, and also with the keyboard and the mouse, you're able to turn more on a dime as opposed to using two Joy-Cons. So, I mean, that's just one major thing that I think all games should be able to do, gaming systems, period, is make, if it's usable for the computer, it should be able to be used on a controller. But that's the discussion that has to be had between gaming companies and the people who create the games.
Hey, this is Brian chiming in real quick from the Evolve team. I was kind of curious, maybe some of the quad gods can kind of fill me in on this. Some of the companies out there like Logitech, obviously Microsoft, they're making strides to, you know, make these games more accessible. Are there events or are there tournaments out there that are easily, you know, found if you were interested in kind of, you know, being a spectator or getting involved in some of those tournaments?
Yeah, I'm not sure where my other teammates went, but Yeah, no, there are. There's it's the Logitech G. They're gonna throw another tournament soon. They threw one last year. I believe it was for like $25,000. The winner. They broke it up so everybody who made it received money. But they're gonna do another one sometime this, I believe. I don't want to put a date on it, but I believe sometime in like the summertime through the fall. But if you like, they can follow you guys on Discord, or they can join our Discord. There's a sign up process. So when you sign up, you have to get a letter from your doctor stating like whatever your disability is. I'm gonna give. I believe I gave you guys the information before, but I'll give it to you again just in case, so you guys can post it in your Discord. Once they fill out the paperwork, the doctor, Logitech will let them know they're eligible, and then from there, it's like you could just play whatever tournament. They let you know in their Discord like what tournaments are coming up, and then they go from there. But it's not so much of a hard sign up process. I just think the earlier you get it done, the quicker you'll be available to participate. But as of right this minute, they don't have any tournaments right now, but they are going to have another one in a few months, because we were listening to some of the conversations that they were having. They were super excited about the last one, so they're definitely working on this year.
Thanks for that.
Fantastic. We don't have any more questions, it looks like, from the chat. I also want to make sure that I'm cognizant of within our own panel. Do you guys have questions for each other? I mean, Drew just had this amazing presentation, and a lot of it was new information for myself, but I didn't know if everybody, if anybody had any questions for Drew, or if Drew had any questions for anybody else in the panel.
I had one more question, and the Flying Hawaiian had brought it up. Is like the impact of virtual reality, because I think gaming is headed more and more in that direction, and having more games being immersive. How will, I guess, adaptive gaming equipment adapt to virtual reality in the future? I feel like for myself, some of the pieces of equipment are very cumbersome and heavy, and they haven't really, it seems like, designed that with accessibility in mind. So do we have any thoughts on like how virtual reality games will impact the accessibility scene?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of just goes back to, once again, these companies who are coming out with the new virtual reality headsets and those different options for gaming, working with people who know adaptive gaming equipment and know how to make things accessible, to ensure that when they do come out with that equipment, that we can use it with adaptive controllers. I think the virtual reality headsets, a lot of them, I do see a difficulty in a lot of times getting those. So you can use adaptive controllers alongside of those. There's a lot of, I think, big problems, I think, with VR and getting that to integrate with a lot of the adaptive gaming equipment currently. So if that does become more popular, hopefully they will work alongside of people who do know adaptive gaming and do know the equipment, so we can make sure that people who can't access the hand controllers for the VR headsets can use alternative options to play those games.
Awesome, thank you.
I was wondering about accessibility when it comes to the driving games and steering wheels. Like, do you think it would be some type of accessible steering wheels for people that want to play games like Forza, Need for Speed, stuff like that, where they won't have to use gas and pedals, like gas and brake pedal?
Yeah, and I think you can. So if you mean like if somebody uses those adaptive driving controls, like the ones they have for those different games.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I've seen a couple different people. No company's come out with one that's right now made accessible, unfortunately.
Okay.
But I've seen people come out with ones that they physically adapt them. So people do like
customly done, you mean?
Yeah, like they customly done, or they do 3D printed adaptions, or they wire something to it. Unfortunately, there's nothing out there right now that's yeah, because I think that gets into a very you almost have to customize something like that, just because it's what works for one person might not work for another person. So if they come out with one universally accessible driving controller,
yeah, it might not. Okay, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, but
and reach as far as they wanted to.
yeah, but I think it would be a really good option for someone to come out with one for, like you said, that instead of the gas pedal, maybe it's a switch port where they can plug in whatever switch they want to do the
Yeah, yeah,
gas. Um,
definitely.
but unfortunately, no one's come out with anything like that yet.
Okay.
All right, I think that is all of the questions that we had. I'll throw it back to you, Jordan.
All right, so I think up next, we have a video from Mike the Quad, who is pretty involved on Twitch if you want to go check him out. But he's done a demonstration of him using the Xbox adaptive controller. So we want to throw that up just so for everyone kind of to see it in action.
All right, please enjoy.
Hey, what's up, everybody? My name is Mike Luckett. I go by Mike the Quad on Twitch, and I'm here to show you a little bit on how I play video games. Let me show you my setup. Okay, here is my controller setup. Everything is on a lap desk, and we have the Xbox Elite 2 controller. We have the Xbox Adaptive Controller. Connected to the Adaptive Controller are the Logitech Adaptive Gaming Kit buttons, and they are both co-piloted to work as one controller. This specific setup is for Apex Legends. I have the buttons corresponding in a way to where it makes it a lot more intuitive for me to play. For the D-pad buttons, for the up D-pad, I have corresponding to this button right here, and this corresponds to heals. I have the right D-pad corresponding to this button, and this corresponds to grenades. Over here on this side, this corresponds to the Y button, which switches my weapons. I also have this button here, which corresponds to my pinging, if I wanted to ping anything. I have this button right here, which corresponds to reloading, or the X button. And then this button right here is what I'd use to rest my forearm to use the function that will aim down sights when I'm playing. And then on these two buttons right here for the Xbox Adaptive Controller, this right here is my melee button, and this right here is my jump button. I also have the trigger switched through the Xbox, so then the right trigger functions as the left, and the left trigger functions as the right. It makes it a lot easier for me to play by placing my palm over the left thumbstick, and I can move the thumbstick and then activate the left trigger, which allows me to shoot. And then I can rest my right forearm onto this button right here, and then also use my right hand or palm to use the right stick and look around. And then I can hit any other button that I would need to without even looking. All right, we're here at the Apex Legends firing range, and I just want to demo a little bit on how each button works live, and then we're going to cut it to a highlight clip. And then I just wanted to say, before all that happens, thank you so much for letting me have the opportunity to speak with y'all about how I play video games and to bring more awareness to adaptive gaming. Thank you so much. All right, now let's go ahead and take a look at this demo. Basically, this is me aiming down sights, and I'm able to use both sticks to aim. And if I want to shoot, I just press the left trigger, like so. And if I wanted to reload, I could reload. If I wanted to switch my weapons, I press the Y button, and then I could shoot. And if I wanted to reload, I could do it again. And then also if I wanted to ping, if I wanted to switch or use my shields or health, I can. Same thing with the grenades. Just do this, throw the grenade. I can put away my gun so I can walk around a lot faster. And I have the slide button to my right stick. So every time I press down on the right stick, I'll slide. Every time I press on the left stick, I'll sprint. So then I'm able to do a little bit of a sprint slide. Sprint slide jump. And that's our demo. Thank you so much again. Here's a highlight clip. Have a great day.
Oh shit. The dude on the right's not gonna push anymore. I hit him 44. Oh, nice. He's on blood.
I'm going up high.
I'm not done yet.
Stand it down. That bandit. Reloading.
Oh, right there. Oh, my boy.
Gotcha.
Oh.
No more dying today. Frag out.
Hey, let's go, baby.
Mad Max and the Arc Nemesis. What?
I got him.
I downed one. They gonna be recharging my shields.
Enemy down. This squad.
Oh my gosh.
Showing us that video from Mike the Quad. Very cool seeing it in action. We have what some of you folks have all been waiting for, our giveaway announcements and our winners. Based on our responses in the giveaways, we have 3 winners selected. The first winner of the $50 Steam gift card, Sino Ursa. That's our first winner. Congratulations. We will be reaching out to you in Discord. We'll get you your Steam key so you can get that gift card. The other winner we have is Adryes. I think I'm saying that correct. Adryes. You are our second winner. Congratulations. And drum roll, the last winner we have for our $50 Steam gift card is Solitude. Congratulations, Solitude. You are our third winner for our $50 Steam gift card. Really appreciate everyone showing up in the giveaways chat. Great questions added. I can go ahead and read actually their responses. Let's see. Adryes loves his PC. It lets him play all of his games with his friends. Let's find Sino Ursa. My Hodas, flight stick plus throttle, super immersive for flight and space games. It's just a different experience for controllers and wheels altogether. And Solitude, he also loves his PC. Though it's old and needs to be updated, lives on it 24/7, and it's essentially my life. So it's obviously the most important piece of equipment. But that is going to do it for our giveaways. I really appreciate all you guys being involved in the giveaways chat, involved in the stream. I'm going to pass it back to Kevin, our wonderful host. And we can continue conversations if you like.
Alrighty, thank you guys so much for joining us. Thank you so much to our special guest, Drew, to our entire panel of people that have been answering questions. You guys have been amazing. Thank you so much for being a part of this and for being so interactive with our chat. And thank you again so much to our chat who asked some incredible questions, who got us really involved in this. And ultimately, we're just really excited for the future of adaptive gaming, and we're all ready for what's going to come next. So just keep looking out for streams from us. We're going to be posting everywhere on our Facebook, on our YouTube, on our Twitch, on our Discord to see what types of future events we're going to have. We're going to have more events like this hopefully in the future where we have more guest speakers on maybe more specific subjects around adaptive gaming and adaptive gaming equipment. But this is going to be a series, the Adaptive Gaming Experiences series. So please feel free to leave us a follow, hang around, and and check out our Discord. We're going to be talking in there and putting together a lot of fun stuff coming up in the future. So thank you again for tuning in, everybody, and we will talk to you soon, hopefully. Take care.
Thanks all.